Start off by sharing some updates related to BSMA. As all of you know, I'm part of the community. We have updated our website, so I invite you all to join and not only evaluate membership, but join the organization and sign up for our weekly BioIntel newsletter. I also want to remind you of a few upcoming virtual and in-person events, specifically our Education Academy, which has been postponed to the first quarter of 2021, as well as our virtual and in-person conferences, both in the United States, in the San Francisco Peninsula, as well as in Europe, specifically in Brussels. So on to today's webinar. I will, besides having the opportunity to welcome our panelists, I want to take the time to also thank Lucy Hanks in advance for her time and energies in putting this webinar together with me. A few reminders regarding the webinar. I do ask that all attendees remain on mute, that we utilize the chat for all communication, including questions and comments. Those questions and comments can be directed to me as well as to Lucy Hanks, and you'll see our names in the drop-down menu for the chat. And also remind you that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the BSMA website. So with that said, I'd like to introduce Stephen and Grant in preparation to their discussion. Following their review of this important topic, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, as well as a review of the be4ward organization. Of course, contact information for both Stephen and Grant will be made available, and also any next steps. If there are any questions that we just do not have time to address, or comments, or any other topics that we didn't have a chance to review, we will be asking that you include your email in the chat, and the be4ward staff and leadership team will be contacting you directly. So with that said, I'd like to welcome both Stephen McIndoe as well as Grant Courtney. Starting with Steve, he's currently the Vice President at be4ward, and he has been since 2009 helping healthcare clients with a number of serialization and packaging and management related consulting engagements. As I mentioned, besides being the VP of the organization, he heads be4ward's serialization practice. Prior to joining be4ward, Stephen spent 5 years at Capgemini as a principal management consultant in the UK life science and supply chain practices. Welcome, Stephen. And supporting and participating and co-leading the discussion today is also Grant Courtney, who's a principal consultant with be4ward. He has spent the last 25 years working in the healthcare and consumer goods industry, both in manufacturing and supply chain and commerce positions. Over the last 12 years, Grant has worked closely with industry associations like BSMA, manufacturers, and the EMVO and EU Commission designed focus on the design and implementation of the European Union FMD legislation and systems, which is core to the discussion today. So again, welcome Stephen and Grant, and I will hand it over to you for this really key and awesome presentation.
Thank you very much, Horatio. Just let me check that you can hear me okay. Perfect, thank you. Yes, first let me thank you for inviting us to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure. So you'll be hearing from both myself and Stephen. I don't know if you want to say hi, Stephen.
Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay, and look forward to speaking to you a bit later on in the presentation.
That's great. Thank you, Stephen. We can indeed. So Horatio, if you can go on to the next slide, that'd be great. So just very, very briefly, this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to look at what is an EU FMD alert. Some of you may be very familiar, others may not have been so familiar with the EU FMD, just depending if you supply products into Europe or not. but we want to look at why they're important to regulatory and legal compliance, and also the sales revenue of a company. We'll then move on to looking at how the DSCSA returnable alerts work, and how they're very, very similar and have similar issues and needs to the EU FMD. And we're making some of those comparisons, especially as the EU FMD is already live, and so we can look to some learnings from Europe to apply to the US. We'll look at what capabilities are needed to effectively manage EU alerts, and then we can look at those learnings and how they can be applied. Once we've got through that, we'll open it up to questions and we can have a Q&A session at the end. Right, moving on. So I don't want to bore you if you're already aware of this, but it is perhaps worth just spending a couple of minutes looking at what the EU FMD is all about, and also how alerts work within the context of the EU FMD. So back in February last year, every prescription pack that is introduced into the supply chain had to have two features on it. The first of these is a tamper-evident label, so that the contents of the pack remain in the pack. And secondly, a 2D data matrix with a product code, serial number, batch, and expiry dates within it. And that unique identifier allows every single pack in the supply chain to be uniquely identified and verified. So they were the two features that were applied to every prescription pack. And the way this works is when the manufacturer makes a batch of products, they will upload those unique identifiers that are held in the barcode into a medicines verification system. And there's a network of IT systems across Europe. The products then flow all the way through to the endpoint, for instance, to a hospital or a pharmacy, etc. And the packs are scanned and checked to ensure that the unique identifier is in the system, and also that that identifier is in a status that allows it to be dispensed. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. So here we have, let's say, a pack of medicine, and it's just about to be handed over to the patient in the pharmacy or in hospital. The pack will be scanned, and that's what we mean by that transaction. And what we're looking for is to ensure that that unique identifier is in that system, that national system. Now, if the number is there and it is in a status to allow it to be dispensed, then everything's good. However, there are some things that can trigger an alert. For example, if the serial number is missing, so it's not in the system, or if that serial number has previously been marked as dispensed. You can't have two packs both being dispensed. That would indicate perhaps that one of them was suspect. You can have other statuses, such as the pack has been exported out of Europe, and clearly you shouldn't be authenticating a product in a pharmacy if the pack has already left Europe. So it looks for whether the serial number is there, and it checks that the status is okay to be dispensed. If it fails those checks, then an alert is raised. That alert is sent back to the client that scanned the pack. So in our example, the retail pharmacy or hospital. It is also sent to the national competent authority, so the regulator in the country. And obviously that would depend on whereabouts in Europe the pack has been scanned, so Germany, France, etc. And then the alert is also sent to a European system that routes it back to what's called the onboarding partner. Effectively, we mean the market authorization holder or the manufacturer there. So you can see that that alert is sent to a number of parties, and then that alert must be investigated to understand what went wrong. Because with all of these alerts, they could be down to a falsified product being in the supply chain. Next slide. So where are we over the last year in Europe? If you look at that blue line, it tracks the number of scans that are happening in Europe per week. And you can see that that peaked on the blue scale at about 180 million scans per week. So you can see that this is a high volume system being used right across Europe. Just out of interest, the two dips that you see, one is Christmas and the New Year, that first dip, and that second dip is the start of the COVID situation in Europe. So you can see that volumes of dispensed medicines dropped, but you can see they're back on the increase there. So yeah, up to 180 million scans per week in Europe, 160 million. But also interesting is the red line. And what that is showing is the percentage of scans which trigger an alert. And that started right up at over 6%. But in the last year, that's dropped to somewhere between 0.5 and 1%. Now, interestingly enough, we don't think that up to 1% of all products in Europe is falsified. And therefore, there's something else going on with those scans. And in fact, what's actually happening is that there are data errors, administration errors, or process errors, where perhaps people are scanning the pack twice, perhaps they've dispensed it, and then they scan it for a second time or a third time. Or the manufacturer has failed to upload the data into the system. So when the pharmacist scans the pack, it can't find the serial number. So you can see that there are a number of failures which are explainable, which have nothing to do with falsified packs. But of course, there's the alternative that actually this is a falsified pack in the supply chain. So the EMVO are working very, very hard at the moment to solve those false alerts. But let's have a look now why it's important to get on top of these alerts as they come through. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so the first thing is that there is actually a legal compliance reason that you must answer the alerts. It's written into the legislation. So as a manufacturer, when you get one of these alerts, you have to investigate them and provide feedback to say what was the most likely cause. Interestingly enough, the manufacturer may be able to root cause that if they were the cause. Perhaps they hadn't uploaded the data or they set the status incorrectly. But there are people further down the supply chain that might have done something wrong, like exporting a pack and then reintroducing it without changing the status or scanning it twice. So the manufacturer can't always root cause, but certainly they are the starting point for an investigation, and they must feed back to the authorities very quickly. And in some countries, that's as fast as 24 or 48 hours. So there is a compliance reason to be rapidly responding to alerts. If we move beyond compliance, however, there are patient safety and sales revenue impacts of alerts. So if we look at the patient impacts, if a product is scanned and it sends up an alert, then that pack shouldn't be dispensed because quite clearly it is potentially a falsified product. Now at that point, if an alternative of the same product isn't available, it may be the case that an alternative product is provided to the patient. And it's quite unusual that once a patient is started on a drug that they would be switched back to the original one. So there are concerns that if your pack's alert, then that could mean people moving on to another product and you losing those sales. The other one is product availability. It is possible for a whole batch of product to fail. Let's say the manufacturer hasn't uploaded the serial numbers for the entire batch. Then every single pack in that batch will alert. Now, if this is a product which is in short supply or some type of specialist product, then that could even lead to product shortages and patients not receiving medically critical products, etc. And then the last one is interesting. If products constantly alert, it could be that the pharmacy returns those back to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler may then choose to return those back to the manufacturer and expect some type of refund in doing so, because they can't move those products down the supply chain because they're alerting. And if the alert was down to the manufacturer, it may be fair that those products are returned and some reimbursement given. However, if those alerts are due to somebody further down the supply chain making an error, then perhaps it's not so fair that the manufacturer reimburses in those circumstances. So you can see that there are both compliance reasons why you have to respond to alerts, but also there are patient safety and sales revenue implications of not getting this right. And ultimately, if your products are alerting, then people will see that as a sign of quality of your product, irrespective of whether the tablet or the injectable or whatever is actually of good quality. Now, this is, if you like, a secondary indicator as to the quality of your products. So there's a reputational issue here as well. Okay, let's move on. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Stephen, and Stephen will take you through, in a similar way, the DSCSA returns model, which is slightly different from the European model.
Thanks, Grant, and hello again, everybody. If you could move me on to the next slide, that would be good. What we've got on the screen here at the moment is a very simplified picture of both the supply chain at the top of the page and then some highlights around what happens with particularly the DSCSA Saleable Returns activity, which is the part of the DSCSA legislation that is coming into force in November this year, and therefore that's the focus of this conversation. I'm also going to assume that everybody on the call understands broadly what DSCSA is, what serialization is in the US. But if you do need some more help understanding that, feel free to reach out to us after this call. So let's look at saleable returns and what needs to be done around saleable returns. Across the top of the screen there, we've got a typical supply chain. Manufacturer manufactures the product, and in an entirely analogous way to Europe, the manufacturer places on the pack what is termed to be in the US model a serialized numeric identifier, but it's very, very similar indeed to what gets placed on a pack in Europe. That's a 2D barcode with a product code, I might refer to that as a GTIN, a serial number, a lot, and an expiry. That gets put on the pack, but unlike Europe, that information then generally doesn't get shared with anybody because it's not, there is no central system at this point in the US to share that information. So it's a currently sort of blind almost serialize and keep, although certain manufacturers may choose because of their supply chain decisions to share some of that information with some downstream partners. Wholesalers then receive the product, and once this latest milestone in the DSCSA legislation comes in, they will process that product as they do today. But should they have that product returned from their downstream supply chain and they want to put that product back into stock to reuse it, this piece of legislation requires them to verify that the SNI, the serialized numeric identifier on the pack, essentially matches a serialized numeric identifier that the manufacturer put onto the pack. The legislation does allow for that information to be passed either electronically to the manufacturer or manually, but we'll focus on the electronic system of them during this conversation. So essentially what the manufacturer, what the wholesaler, does is the wholesaler receives the pack. If they know they want to return it to stock, they would typically use their systems to scan that pack, and then that operation of scanning would raise a verification request. That verification request would be passed to one VRS, or verification router service, that wholesaler would have contracted with to provide a service to them for answering these verification questions. That verification router service would pick up that message. That verification router service may or may not be connected to the manufacturer, who effectively owns the product, is the marketing authorization holder, and is responsible for responding to questions about those products. If it is, if the verification router service is connected directly to that manufacturer, then it would pass that verification request to the manufacturer's responder system. That responder system would essentially look up the serialization information in its database. If it found that that information all matched an SNI that the manufacturer had put onto a particular pack, so that's the product, the serial number, the lot, and the expiry all match as being something they recognize was put onto a pack, it would return a message to the VRS service to say, yes, this is verified. That message would then be passed back to the wholesaler in pretty much real time, and the wholesaler's system would display to the operator or whoever, yes, this product has verified. In a similar way to Europe, though, if the manufacturer's responder service can't match all the data in that serialized numeric identifier, then it will respond with a false to the question, is this verified? And it will then also potentially provide some additional information. And this is where the US model is currently in a state of development to a certain extent. The basic rule says that the manufacturer's system has to respond with a true or false to verified. The rules also then give the manufacturer's system the ability to provide some additional information. That might be additional information at a very simple level, that the for instance, it recognizes the product code, the GTIN, but doesn't recognize the serial number, or it might recognize the product code and the serial number and not the lot number, etc. Or within recent discussions and developments of the standards, some manufacturers have expressed the desire to be able to provide additional information over and above that. So, for example, if a manufacturer has knowingly recalled a product, they may want to pass that information along with the verification response as well. And the standards have been worked out recently to allow them to do that. And there is a certain amount of technology development and testing going on at the moment to make sure that the verification router services can indeed pass that information. Raising an appropriate expectation about November this year, though, I think it's fair to say, working with many of our clients, that actually on initial go live, there's going to be a fairly basic response provided automatically of a yes, it's verified, no, it hasn't. And perhaps when it hasn't verified, some of those simple, if you like, mechanical messages of, yes, it hasn't verified because I have the GTIN, but I don't have the serial number, etc. So that's a little conversation about how the model works. Just another thing to point out about the verification router services. As I mentioned before, there is no central system at the moment in the US, as you're all aware. And indeed, the way the legislation is written, the DSCSA legislation is written, there is no mandate for a single verification router service to be provided by the FDA or similar central body. So the industry has provided, suppliers in the industry have pulled together under the guise of the HDA and provide several different solutions to this. So there are a number of different solution providers who you can contract with to provide a verification router service. And indeed, all of those verification router services themselves then talk to each other to route messages between themselves, so that any one wholesaler or any one manufacturer only needs to connect to one VRS service. If you can move me on to the next slide. So looking at some of the issues that we're going to face. First of all, a bit of good news in terms of the sheer volume of transactions that we're talking about here. I think from memory it was McKesson, one of the big three wholesalers, that estimated that there was something in the region of 60 million saleable return packs per year that were processed. And therefore, if you remember back to the numbers that Grant was talking about, and indeed you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, we're actually talking about orders of magnitude of there being quite a lot fewer saleable returns in a year than Europe processes pack dispensing authentications in a week. So for those of you involved in Europe, I think the first message is the number of packs that are going to be processed through the saleable returns is going to be orders of magnitude lower than are processed in Europe for everyday scans. So one might expect, therefore, that the issues associated with this model are going to be proportionately lower as well. Having said that, the experience that we had in Europe when we went live of the quality of the data, the quality of the system connects, etc., not being quite what they could be, and therefore those initial high rates of scans causing issue, I think one can expect that also to occur in the US, because for many participants in the US supply chain, as I said before, we've effectively been serializing, of course doing some internal quality checks to ensure that what we've put on the packs is appropriate as manufacturers and correct. But the acid test of these serialization solutions is always when you try and connect different companies' systems together to then check and scan the products downstream. It's then when you start to really discover where you've got some issues with data, etc. So one can expect as we go live that there's going to be a proportionally higher number of issues with the scans. I think it's also true to say that, like any go live, it's probably going to take some supply chain partners longer to actually get on stream, and therefore the initial numbers of scans that occur through saleable returns are going to be lower, which may well balance out the effect. But over time, we'd expect to see the same kind of curves in the US of the rate of error falling and the number of scans perhaps increasing, but staying well below what they are in Europe. Other issue within DSCSA legislation, similar to Europe, is if you identify through your systems a failed verification request, then the legislation requires you to treat that as a suspect product and do some investigation. So in the similar way to Europe, we're going to need capabilities in the US to investigate and indeed identify in the first place. The one difference down at the bottom right of this slide that I point out is those of you working in Europe at the moment will be aware that the alerts raised in the downstream supply chain from the likes of pharmacies are effectively anonymous when you receive those alerts back at the manufacturer. It's not possible within the system, in fact it's deliberately hidden in the system, as to exactly which pharmacy raised the request. And that therefore presents some issues with investigating issues, and actually leads to the local government run bodies, the national verification organisations, to play a part in the whole issue resolution process between manufacturer and downstream user. In the US, the situation is slightly different because the location that scans a product will include in that scan and those messages the global location number of that location that's scanning. And that effectively, in many cases, will reveal who that downstream partner is, and therefore make the identification potentially of those downstream partners to manufacturers wanting to investigate a good deal easier than it does in Europe. I think that was all I wanted to say on that. Move on to the next slide. So back over to Grant to talk a little bit about the capabilities that we find we need in Europe to deal with alerts.
Thank you, Stephen. And we'll have the next slide, please. Okay, so if you are a manufacturer in Europe, you're receiving these alerts, and depending on the volume of products that you put into Europe, that could be anything from an alert a week up to several thousand a day. Different manufacturers obviously have different volumes and are exposed to the level of alerts differently. But whatever level of alerts you're receiving, this is the type of capability that we believe, based on the best practice and working with our clients, you need to have in place. Starting at the top left is to actually just receive the alert. Obviously, this is an electronic message and it has to be received by the IT systems and then passed through without corrupting or changing the data. So just the physical process of receiving that alert into your systems. Once you've got the alert, the next stage is to prioritize and filter. We've already said that some countries require you to feed back on the status of an alert in particular timelines. So it might be that you prioritize those countries to be worked on faster. The filtering is interesting. If you have received alerts for a particular batch, or you know that you didn't upload the data for a particular batch, then when these alerts come through, you can set filters or either in electronic tools or Excel spreadsheets, etc. So perhaps filter out some alerts that you might already know what's going on. So that's what we mean by the filtering, and also the type of alerts. So once you've received them, you've prioritized which ones you're going to work on in which order, and perhaps you've filtered out some of those which you already know the answers to, or you suspect you do. Then you enter an analysis phase. And this analysis phase helps you just to start to understand what the root cause is, whether you think it was down to yourself or perhaps is external. And as a result of that, what level of investigation you're going to have to do in order to resolve this alert. Investigations typically start internally, perhaps to make sure that you did make this product, or you didn't have any procedural errors when you uploaded the data, etc. And once you've done that, it may be that you also need to carry out some external investigation. For instance, if that pharmacy had tried to dispense the same pack more than once, then the second time they try and dispense it, it would have alerted, and therefore you may have to notify the authorities and the system owners that you don't think it's yourself, it might be external. And that's the reporting back phase. And then finally, document and close. These processes are effectively pulling into question the quality of your products and your data. And so they may be linked with your quality management processes, etc. And there will be a need to document those and then close out any alerts. The final box on the right there, corrective action. If you do find that this alert was down to yourself, perhaps you didn't upload the data or there was an error in the data you uploaded, then you're going to have to carry out some type of corrective action. And we would also suggest that there are measurements put across the system to make sure that you know how long this is all taking. The two bottom icons are quite important and something that's frequently overlooked. The first is process maintenance and improvement. As Stephen said, when you go live with these systems, you might be receiving a lot of alerts. There might be some bugs in your system or procedural errors. And just by doing a sort of plan, do, check, act cycle, you can go back, and alerts are actually very, very good, sometimes highlighting issues that you've got in your own systems or data. So going back, reviewing those processes, and sometimes that can be with third parties, especially if you contract out the manufacturing, etc. So going back, checking your processes and doing any maintenance improvements. And then the final one is link with other impacted processes. For example, you might have a customer service department that's been contacted about an alert, and you now need to use these systems and processes to get back to your customer service department and give them the answer. Or where we looked at products that are being returned back to you because they've alerted, then perhaps there needs to be an investigation as to why they alerted before you reimburse or pay for those products to be returned, because you don't want to be paying for returned stock where the alert wasn't your fault. So that's just a very, very high level overview of some of the core capabilities, and these can be done with policies, processes, and RACI, so the sort of accountability charts, and systems can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, but we do find that as the volume of alerts grow over time, Excel spreadsheets and these types of tools aren't robust enough, and ultimately you do find yourself putting in place more robust systems that can deal with the volume over a longer period. So policies, processes, accountabilities, and the systems all need to be in place. Okay, with that, I'll pass over to Stephen.
Stephen struggles to come off mute. Could you move me on to the next slide, please? Okay, so let's just talk about some of the learnings as they're going to apply to the US potentially. First of all, back to something I said earlier in terms of the numbers of alerts. Let's just remember that this is the first time in the US supply chain that we're trying to actively connect IT systems to pass information down at the level of serialized individual packs. I know we pass information today at the level of orders and lot level traceability through the likes of T3s. I would point out that none of that is going to change. This milestone of the DSCSA legislation that's occurring in November this year simply adds to existing legislation. It doesn't take away from any of the likes of the track and trace activity. But simply because we are connecting systems in an automated fashion and interfacing them at that serial number level, we're going to see issues with that, both in terms of business process, the IT systems, the way the IT systems work and interact with each other, etc. And that's a lot of what contributes to the initial high volume of issues then calming down over time. Something else to consider here is, yes, you definitely need to raise suspect investigation if you do get these verification failures. So in a similar way to the capabilities that Grant just talked about for Europe, companies are currently thinking about, or have already in some cases, implemented similar capabilities to manage these alerts. We also need to remember that the DSCSA legislation has some fairly stringent timelines within it. So for example, if you become aware that you have a falsified, potentially falsified product, you need to make the secretary aware, the FDA representatives aware, within 24 hours. So you need to make sure that your processes and systems can support those kinds of short timelines. And the other thing I'll just touch on here is, again, taking learning and experience back from Europe's go live. There's a lot of conversation at the moment, a lot of discussion between the FDA and industry partners about the reality of the timeline. should we go live in November this year? It's actually already effectively delayed by a year. But the industry has put in petitions to ask for delay. Personally, one would assume that the FDA are taking careful consideration of that, as well as looking to Europe to learn from their implementation. Undoubtedly, when we do go live, if we did go live in November, there will be teething issues. One might expect the FDA to have a degree of reasonableness about enforcement, perhaps, when the go live occurs, because there will be issues and the industry will take time to iron out those issues. Interestingly, if I think back to when Europe went live, there was a lot of debate, and Grant may be able to say more about this or add to it when he comes back on, but there was a lot of debate just before the initial go live as to whether Europe should delay over time. Europe actually took the decision, as we all know, to implement, knowing there would be issues, and then officially use the initial implementation period as a period to learn and settle the systems down. So as I say, one would hope that the FDA would allow us to do that. But at the moment, there's a lot of work going on with the HTA, the verification router service partners, and certain key people, supply chain partners involved in all of the testing. A lot of that is demonstrated to work and operate successfully at the test level. And certainly we have a number of clients at the moment who are busily implementing all of their systems so that they can provide both responder services and scan at the wholesaler level. With that, I think you can move on to questions.
Great. Well, thank you both, Stephen and Grant, for a very informative review of both the experience and lessons learned in Europe, as well as the anticipated timelines and actions within the US. We do have a few questions, and I'd like to, again, welcome and invite everyone who's on the webinar to provide their questions to both myself and Lucy. The first question I have for either Steve or Grant is, can you describe and what is the scale of the problem for saleable returns compared to Europe?
I think, as I mentioned already, I think we can go to the numbers of scans. So 160 to 180 million a week in Europe, something of the order of 60 million a year saleable returns forecast in the US. So order of magnitude less in the US, which is great news because it means that obviously we don't need to dedicate quite as much resource to the US saleable returns problem as many companies had to in Europe. And also, of course, it means that we've got a significantly lower amount of product movement that's under threat from this. In Europe, pretty much every pack that gets sold goes through this process of scanning and authenticating. In the US, a small percentage of product gets returned for sale.
Okay, great. Transitioning over to some of the questions from the audience, can you speak a bit about how COVID-19 and the experience in this pandemic is playing into and what the impact is on these processes and regulations and timelines?
Yeah, I'm happy to start that. And Stephen, by all means, you can give a US perspective. The first thing to say is around scope. Vaccines are within the scope of the European legislation. So in principle, they do need to be verified. However, because of product availability, and I'm not just talking about a COVID vaccine, but also any sort of COVID therapeutics that are going on the market, some companies have asked that in order to ensure the supply of products, that they are given an exemption to have to serialize the products. So effectively, you're putting the supply of the products over the EU FMD requirements. And there have been some countries that have looked at that, and it tends to be on a case-by-case basis. However, that's very, very concerning, because the falsification of COVID products is probably the biggest target for criminals in many, many years. And we expect actually there to be an awful lot of falsified vaccines and therapeutics, etc., on the market. So we wouldn't encourage people to look for exemptions. Really get them serialized, get them authenticated within supply chain. So yeah, there has been they are in scope. There has been some exemptions, but I think a lot of the industry agree that it's probably not a great thing to exempt. In fact, this is exactly the time you want authentication services to be running.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from the audience is it possible and is it common for smaller manufacturers to outsource their alert management operations? Can you speak to this?
Yeah, I can. And once again, Stephen, please feel free to come in. We haven't seen smaller companies outsourcing the entire alert management processes. What we have seen, though, is we work with a number of clients where they want to understand what the business processes they should have put in place, how those processes link with things like their quality management, customer services, also what tools they should deploy, and ultimately whether there should be any IT systems. So in order to, I guess, help the clients get there much, much quicker, with our experience, we've worked with a number of deployments and got their teams operational and up and running with those. So that's typically how we help. We've also helped implement tools that themselves can reduce the workload for individuals, so they can do some of that filtering and analysis of the alerts. So that ultimately then reduces the workload for the individuals. So there's a combination of getting clients up and running using our experience, and also helping them deploy some tools in this space. But personally, I haven't seen people outsource it. Stephen, I don't know if there's any other experience from your end.
I think in terms of Europe, there has been a little bit of outsourcing, but more at the level of the overall serialization support model within businesses. But one has to remember that essentially many of the processes, particularly when one gets to the resolving of issues, are multifunctional. So there may be elements of the mechanics and, if you like, the mini project management of the issues that you can outsource. But many times when you're talking about resolving these kinds of issues that we're talking about with alerts, etc., you're talking about a cross-functional activity between quality departments, regulatory departments, manufacturing, third-party manufacturing organization management, etc. So it becomes quite an involved activity, which many of our clients certainly feel they need to keep a grip of themselves, even if they are relatively small operations.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from the audience, and you spoke to this earlier today, is regarding compliance in both the EU and US. Can you speak to the pace at which these organizations implemented or worked toward their solutions? And were they vastly different in criteria, specifically in compliance?
Sure. The two legislations are running to a different pace, and also the US legislation has a number of milestones with functionality being added along the way. In Europe, the deadline was back in February last year, and pretty much it was a big bang, and it went live in February. As Stephen was saying, some countries in Europe did allow, if you like, a soft go live. So perhaps some people that hadn't got up and running or capable they were allowed to just sort of slip into that timeline. The other thing is that they haven't enforced when that product is being dispensed and scanned. If an alert is raised, then typically you shouldn't be dispensing that because it could be falsified. However, a number of countries have allowed a softening of that, where they're still allowed to dispense the product. So as Stephen said, it's sort of it was certainly a big bang. It was certainly enforced on day one, but there was a sort of softer approach. But the majority of the countries now in Europe have come to the end of that soft deployment, and we're now in an enforcement phase. I think that the national competent authorities will actually start to now follow up and enforce those timelines, etc. But we were just getting to that point when COVID struck. So I think that has probably softened this for a little bit longer. Once we come out of COVID, you'll see the national competent authorities following up. The other thing is that the European systems have a reporting capability that's going to be provided to the authorities. And once they've got that reporting capability, we suspect that the authorities will be much better informed to know what to chase and where to apply the pressure. The other thing is we have seen already during audits, auditors coming in and wanting to see how these processes work and operate. So certainly it is ramping up. So the sort of first year was a bedding in phase. The second year, I think, is going to start to move towards enforcement.
Great. Well, before we close out the discussion today, and once again, thank you to Stephen and Grant, and of course, Lucy in the background, is we wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to share both Grant and Stephen's contact information, as well as the be4ward website. And also, Stephen and Grant, if you'd like to have some closing comments and share some insights into the organization and how you are helping organizations within healthcare and life sciences transform their supply chains.
So thanks for that. Yeah, just looking at the time, making this very quick. I think as Grant mentioned before, we have worked with a large number of clients, both manufacturers and wholesale organizations. So if you're looking to implement this sort of capability, please come and talk to the likes of be4ward, because we've got lots of learnings and we can help accelerate that for you. We're also fully aware of the tools that Grant alluded to that might help you implement more efficient processes internally around these sorts of things. And then lastly, just broader than serialization, to remind you all that be4ward is essentially a pharmaceutical and med device finished goods supply chain consulting practice. So we can help clients in any of the business processes, implementations of IT systems, etc., that you need to do in order to move your finished goods around the world.
Great. Well, once again, thank you, Stephen and Grant. I hope for the audience this has been informative, not only in terms of the actions taken in the EU with the Falsified Medicines Directive and their progress, as well as the phased approach that the US and FDA have taken in regards to the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. As shared earlier and before the presentation started, the recording will be available on the BSMA website. And once again, for any additional questions or comments, Grant and Stephen are available. And thank you all for joining. Please have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your evening. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Thanks very much, Horatio.
Thank you, Stephen. Take care.
Okay, same to you. Bye-bye.